Richard from SharpshootingUK here, guys. Lovely crisp winter day. I have got a basic video here. I think there's actually going to be a series of 3. What I'm going to do is I'm going to explain mounting a scope because simply I get asked about it so much. So I thought I'd run through it. And then that's going to lead on to an area of huge confusion, which is adding minutes to your solutions so that you can get further out. What that means for zeroing, what that means for your ballistics at long range, etc., etc. So I'm going to do that, and I'm also going to show you a little trick about how to get your ret level in the field using a plumb line, or in this case a bore snake. So let's start at the beginning. To mount your scope, I'm simply going to take this one off. So there's the rings, 40mm tier 1s. That's come off the rail. And I'm going to put this svelte little number. I'm going to put that on, and I'm going to demo how it's done. So, first things first, when you are mounting a scope to a picatinny rail, the first thing that you've got to be careful of is make sure when you are putting the rings on the rail that where these little grooves go, the picatinny mount grooves, that if you put them in a slot on the rail that has the screw in that goes down into the receiver of the action, make very sure that that screw is below the line that the little mount arrestor ring is going to go into. If that bears on the top of the screw head, then you're going to twist the whole scope. So you've got to be very careful here. I'll get my rifle out and I'll show you. Okay guys, so if you look here, we've got, see the screw heads? Now, if they are proud, you do not want to use that slot because it will bend the whole scope. You see this one here? There, that one is proud, and that one. So I mustn't use those slots. Now obviously a gunsmith would have done this properly, but if you do any work on your own rifles, these are the type of mistakes you can use. You round off one of these and you think, oh Christ, I've got to try and get one the right thread, and you find one that fits lovely and you think, great, and you don't care that it's proud, and of course then you put your mount on it, you got a big problem. So be aware of that pitfall. I don't use that slot for that reason, so I'll aim for that one, and then this one at the back here, no problems there. So put your rings on the rifle first, having got an idea of the width of the saddle on the scope, so that you know how wide they need to be. And then we're going to start coarse and we're going to get fine. So we're going to coarsely, roughly work out our alignment, and we're going to then start to fine-tune that, get the mounts in the right slots to give the scope good support, allow room for any attachments that we might need on the scope. You've only got so much real estate, you've only got so much mounting room on the scope, so you have to place your rings carefully. Okay, another small but important thing. Let me whip the screen out. Right, so we put our ring on. And then what we do, you see this little bit of play here on the slot? That goes to the front. You push it to the front, and then we do up our screw. And then we use the appropriate torque settings from the manufacturer. Okay, so I'll put the camera down, push that to the front, and do it up. Now, for the love of God, use a premium ring. If there's a simple rule of thumb here, simple as can be, if the ring has sticky tape on the inside, then it goes in the bin. The end. You should have 100% metal to metal contact, so that you distribute the forces, do not crimp the tube, do not mark the tube, and if you want to do that cheaply, you make them oversize and you fill it with sticky tape. which case the sticky tape galls on the bottom of the scope, holds it in place what a crock. Put them in the bin. Rings that are appropriate are very, very exactly made, and they fit the tube really well. A little rule of thumb is, when you put the rings on and the scope's on the top resting and you're doing your rough eye relief, it should go forward and back like that without any major grinding and scraping and twisting and stickiness, because everything's nicely aligned. Okay, a little bit of a, a test there. If it's really wrong, then, check previous thoughts, like I said, about mounting the rings so that they have been tilted by the screw or some other error such as that, dirt underneath, anything like that. So they should go on. The scope be nicely movable forward and back. Now, little thing here, you really don't want this ring right here in front of the saddle. It's very common that when you do that ring up, especially if it's a crappy ring and it just cuts into it, and if you do it up too tight, which a lot of people do, what you will then do is you can actually ruin the magnification of the scope because something slides backwards and forwards here, and it's very common that scopes are damaged by the ring being right here. Now, on a premium scope with a premium ring, it's not a problem, but by and large, it's worth saying to people you want 2 or 3 mil here before your ring, ideally. Okay, and the worse the scope, the worse the mounts, the more that is important. So you want really your ring in the middle. That said, if you put it in the middle, you haven't got room for a mount here for a torch or whatever. So sometimes if you bat smart, that ring, for example, could go there, and then I've got a decent amount of room here to put something. Or particularly at the front, if I put that like that, dead in the middle, that's lovely, but I haven't got any room here and I haven't really got any room here. So if I were clever about it and I could put the ring there, then I've got this nice bit of room here for some sort of attachment. So bear that in mind, because when you lock this all down and zero, you don't really want to have to mess with it because you suddenly realize you can't get your IR illuminator on or your whatever. So, bear in mind where the rings go. Not too close to the saddle. They've obviously got to fit on your rail. You've got to avoid any lumps and bumps that you might have on the rail, such as screw heads. And then you've got to give yourself a little bit of movement so that you can adjust your eye relief before you lock it all in. So I'm going to put the rings on now, the top caps, loosely, get the rifle roughly, exactly right for eye relief, and then we're going to talk about cant, which is crucial. There's a simple trick for leveling this that you can do even in the field in the wind, so I'll show you that now. Now, a little trick for doing up the screws. You want these to be roughly even. So you can't just whack up one side and then do up the other, because they'll be touching on one side and then you'll have a big gap on the other. The simple way of doing it, and I can't do it while holding the camera, is as you're doing them up to get them started, put your thumbnail in the crack, do them up onto that. That will leave you a millimetre gap or so, and then do the same on the other side. And it's just a nice little trick for getting them started fairly evenly. Just do them up onto your fingernail. Okay guys, so what I've done now is I've done these up just onto my fingernail. They will hold the scope from moving, but I can move it backwards and forwards and side to side to get it adjusted just right. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to get behind the rifle. Don't do this roughly, do it properly so you're dead comfortable. Do not end up with a cricked neck. If you are having to strain your neck back to get that picture, no, not good. You can get yourself into any position and convince yourself that it's comfortable. Try doing it for a few hours. So the thing to do normally is to start long and work back. So I'm going to start right up here That's the furthest point I can get with this combo as I've placed the rings at the moment. I could of course change it by moving this ring forward one slot, but at the moment that is far forward and I can come that far back until that ring stops there. So I've got an inch of wiggle room, and I already know I'm in the ballpark because I've put the rear of the scope in roughly the right area here, so I should be okay. If you don't have any front back tolerance for this testing, you need to move one of the rings so that you've got this little bit of leeway. Sometimes you have tons, sometimes you have very little. It rather depends on the rail and ring combo, but there we have it. And it must be said, this is an advantage of slightly narrower rings. If they're that wide, you get less movement, less adjustment range. If they're 1 millimeter wide, then you have more. So big rings, thick, massive rings, aren't always better. So food for thought. If they have perfect contact, because they're properly exactly the right dimensions and they're holding the scope firmly, then you might not need to go completely crazy, which is the whole reason I run these tier 1 rings. Frankly, they're basic ring, super high tolerance and repeatable and bubble and all that, but these are their cheapest rings. And the reason I run them on my biggest gun is to make that point. So, yeah, you don't need to go mad if the rings are a really good fit. So, there we go. I'm now going to get behind the rifle. I'm going to line it up so that I'm all comfortable. I'm going to get it exactly in the right spot, but I'm not going to do it up yet because we've still got to get it level, and that is very important. Now, there is a lot of personal choice here. People's heads and necks are tremendously different shapes and sizes. Then there's different types of stock. Wow, it's a big can of worms, but you've got to be comfortable without cricking your neck. Lowest isn't always best, despite popular opinion that, you know, the scope wants to be sitting right on the barrel. That is not necessarily a given. Up to you. But anyway, I've lined that up now. But we don't do it up yet because we've got to get it level, and that is really, really important. The fundamental principle at play here is, let me just point wildly at the sky like an idiot. Right, here we go. So here's your ret, okay? Now, to dial 50 minutes, you go, right? But imagine that your ret, which you thought was vertical, is actually a bit like that. When you dial 50 minutes, you go that way. So you are adding a load of windage when you should just be going up. And if your ret isn't vertical to the world, to gravity, then you are dialing in trouble. And you don't have to be far off for it to be a big problem when you magnify it by shooting up, by dialing up a great deal of angle. So you have to be perfectly level. This becomes a problem past, well, 500 yards. So really, we have to be level. And you can use your eye. It's like range finding. 9 times out of 10, you're really good. The 10th time, you're really quite badly off. Things in the foreground, slopes and valleys, they trick your eye as to what is vertical and what isn't. So what we do is we use a bubble that we align with the ret. So the ret we put on something vertical, plumb line, for example. We lock the ret in by turning it in the rings so that its bubble is level with the ret being level with the world being level through the plumb line. So you line up the 3 things, the plumb line with the ret with the gun. And then that bubble becomes a fixed point. So when it's in the middle, you know that your ret is vertical. So how do we do that, especially in the field? Well, it's really straightforward. I've got a little trick for this, presuming that you've got a car nearby. Obviously, if you can do this indoors with no wind, then all the better. But one of the things I sometimes do when I'm doing my ballistics training days and people come with no bubble and we really need to sort it then and there in a 20-mile-an-hour wind, is I will hang a bore snake from, which has got a little brass weight on the bottom, doesn't it, from my coat hook in my car. It hangs down there 18 inches or so, and you've got light behind it from the window. I then take the rifle back to the minimum parallax range, so that might be 50 yards or it might be 10, and then we look in the window, which is out of the wind because we close all the doors, and you can see that vertical hanging thing. I'll show you now. Okay, so I come here with my rifle, say 30 yards away, depends on the scope. The IORs will focus very close, so no problem here. Go prone, line up, get the bubble level on the mounts, turn the scope, there you have it. And that there, it's difficult through the camera but easy through the scope, that vertical line is vertical. Line that up to the ret, so it follows the path of the vertical ret. And then we turn the whole scope until everything is lined up with the bubble being central. And when it is, you do up the scope rings. So we have level bubble, vertical line hanging with gravity, matching exactly the vertical line of the ret. Then you do up the rings. Then you're mounted. We do the rings up nice and even, and we do them up to the proper torque, and we're rocking and rolling. Okay, so one of the disadvantages of having so much adjustment range in these modern scopes is that it can be unbelievably hard to zero them if you can't see your splash reliably. You can go to 100 yards and you can be feet off. So bore scoping them is never a bad idea. The way, not bore scope, what's the word I'm looking for? Bore sighting. What you do is you take your bolt out, okay, you put your gun steady on the bags and you look through the actual barrel and you get obviously a tiny little pinhole view. Put that on the center of your A4 target board, okay, and then look up while holding it all steady up where the ret is. If the reticle is 6 foot high and left, you are not going to be anywhere near the paper. So to get you in the rough ballpark, and it is only rough, but it's a start, is, as I say, get the bore looking at your, it tends to see about a sheet of A4, that sort of thing. So look down, put it on the center of your white sheet of A4, or whatever your target is. It needs to be fairly large. Just move the ret till it's on the thing that you can see the target, hopefully, having looked down the bore. So you line them all up. You can also get lasers for this. They point straight down the bore. You put them on the paper, and then you put the scope onto the dot, and you're in the ballpark. Same game. The other way, and to be honest, I think it's easier, is to shoot your first target at something really close, like 25 yards. And then get within a couple of inches there, and then you are, you know, you're in the ballpark at 100 straight away. That is actually the easiest system. So if you have the ability to shoot really close, then that's the way. Then we get zeroed at 100 or whatever it is that we want to shoot at. I prefer a longer zero myself, in the order of 150 or 200, but personal thing. Get the scope bang on, and then we put our zero stop on 0. So we now have 0 labelled on the scope for our chosen range, 0 marked on windage for our chosen range. Then we dial off from that place, don't we? 0 is our first intersection, our first label of the trajectory. At this range, the bullet will be here. I will mark 0 on my scope. From that point, the bullet is dropping, and I will allow for that by moving the scope accordingly. That is what we are doing in principle. We're lining the crosshair up with where the bullet goes. Note that we do not move the bullet. We move the scope to the bullet. That's a subtle and important distinction. And as I say, if you've got a 100-minute scope and everything is straight and flat and true and pointing in the right direction, and your gun is straight and your barrel's not drooping and all of that, you will end up with 50, 60, 40, who knows, something like that minutes remaining from your 100. You never get your 100 minutes above your 0. You are somewhere in the middle of it. So that is why so many scopes are sent back, because people say it's supposed to have 100 minutes and I've only got 40. It's because once you've zeroed, you then start counting. And if you are in the middle of the range, say you're 50-50, say you 0 and you got 50 minutes above, you know that you could actually add 50 minutes more cant to the system, not the scope, but to the whole mounting system, notably, specifically the rail. You could cant that down 50 minutes and you'll still be able to zero. If you canted it down 60 minutes, you can't then actually get to your 0, can you? You're going to be 10 minutes high at your preferred 0 range. So that's the relationship between the adjustment range, where you end up in it when you've zeroed, and how much elevation you can add to a non-optical system, to the rail, to the uni-mount, that will then get you more. Okay, let's count up and see how far we have got. 25, 50, 60, 70, 73. That's excellent. So that's 53 in the scope, and the whole lot is tilted 20 minutes by the rail. So that's great. We'll now have a look at Strelog Pro and see how far that will get us. With these ballistics, that's a very long way. Okay, so if we look at putting the temperature in, density altitude is 200 feet. There's the 0. Speed 2750 at 4 degrees. That's going to calculate that. Right, okay, so if I go to my table, now I've got 73 minutes. Vertical correction here. So at transonic, I am at 1600 yards. That's Mach 1.2, 1200 feet per second in this pressure. Anyway, long story short, that's 60 minutes. I've got 73, 1800 yards. 1800 yards. Just supersonic. Supersonic to 1800, that's pretty cool. And there's 72.5 minutes. So say I were wanting to get to 1,000. I know that this system here, 1,000 yards, I only need 26 minutes. I've got more than twice that, no problemo. In fact, I could have done without the 20-minute rail. On a different gun with different ballistics, you need more. So look there, I need 26 minutes to get to 1,000. If I were to move to a rifle with worse ballistics, what have we got in here? I don't do bad ballistics, but here's an old 6.5 by 47 with a 120 hunting load. Now that's a whole hell of a lot better than a 150 out of a 308, and that's a long 0. But to give you an idea, that one needs to get to 1,000. Right, one sec while I configure the table. Right, gents. Okay, so 1,000 yards in this gun, I need 28.6. It's not too bad, actually. So sometimes you need way more than that. All depends on the ballistics. So you look at what you can get from your scope, look at the adjustment range of the scope and see whether you could add a rail. You can't add a rail on all guns, but you can in picatinny based systems. You can also add elevation into the rings, which is very cool. Only good rings, you know, your tier ones and such like, where you can actually angle the mount, and that would then affect the amount that you get. But in the big rig with the Terminator on, I've got enough for 1,800 yards, and that's without using canted rings like their new 40mm uni mount with 20 minutes in it. So if I did use that, okay, let's say I wanted to get to 2,000 yards. Let's go back to those ballistics in my app. 284, there's that. This is in today's pressure, it'll vary a bit, but by and large, if I added 20 minutes into my mount, okay, so I've got 73 there, 1,800 yards. If I had 93, it gets me to 2,000 yards. I need 93 minutes for 2020. In fact, for 2,000 dead, I need 90. Now, I have 1,919 yards at my Sharpshooting UK training ground. So if I want to get there, I need 1,920. I need 83. And I've got 73. So I need to add a 10-minute cant to the rings, or I can use 10 minutes of hold on the ret. 10 minutes is not unattainable. Any more than that and you're running out of ret at high mag. But yeah, I can lob it 10 minutes. But these are the equations that you need to work out when you're working out what sort of elevation do I need, what's available to me as it stands at the moment, what can I add in for X and Y range with X and Y ballistics. Okay, I hope this clears up some of the smoke and mirrors with it all. So this is the principles at hand, okay? You don't have the whole adjustment range because you zero somewhere in the middle of it, and that depends on the gun. You can find out how much you have left after you've zeroed by dialing up until you hit the stops. Counting them, that's the amount that you've got. If you add a rail to that, that will add the rail's value to that amount that you have available. But don't go too mad, or you won't be able to zero at 100 yards. You'll have to zero at, 300, which starts to get to be a bit of a headache sometimes. So that is that. If you are using a scope with a smaller amount of adjustment range, like an old 1-inch high mag hunting scope, it is perfectly feasible that you will put that on a gun and it will not get on the paper. Because if the gun isn't exactly straight, with the small adjustment range within the scope, you won't be able to get the scope over to meet the bullet, which is what zeroing is. So there's a lot of occasions where scopes are blamed when in fact it's not the scope, and I'm going to do a video on that.